There's norms that we have to break, right? These modes of doing things that we've been doing for a long, long time. And you're talking about breaking some of those old traditions down a little bit and looking at things in a different way.
But really blowing it up completely.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
I love that. Yeah, let's do it.
I think the pandemic was a nice catalyst for some of this stuff because for the first time and only time so far has it been that everybody in the world had to grapple with the exact same thing at the same time, and work related, what the workplace is and what that means changed so quickly for everybody. There were already kind of trends and evolution, but then all of a sudden it was but it has kind of loosened a lot of these core structural foundational pieces that made work and the workplace what they are today. But I think we're seeing that that's getting reinvented by the minute.
This episode of Inside the Process is powered by Trainual, the one app that organizes who does what and how. Check it out at trainual.com.
Well, what is up, everybody? Welcome to another episode of Inside the Process, where we sit down with some of the brightest minds in business to dig into all of their process secrets and best practices to help you continuously improve and level up the work you're doing. I'm Mallory, a 10-year systems and ops veteran turned marketer, and I'm here with Sean, the super awesome training and dev guy. You all know him as Mentor Sean.
Thanks, Mallory. Appreciate it. And I am just really excited today to have with us Barbara Gago, who is the founder and CEO of Pando. And she's been doing some amazing work rethinking career growth and feedback culture. She's all about making sure people can grow in their roles in ways that fit them without the pressure to take on leadership just to feel like they're moving up. And I really identify with that. So I'm excited to dig into that. From championing individual contributors to building equitable feedback systems, she's helping redefine what it means to help and support people at work. We just can't wait to dig into this and hear your take on creating career paths that actually work for everyone. So, Barbara, welcome to Inside the Process.
Thank you both for having me. Excited to be here.
Awesome. Well, you've built a wildly successful career as a marketer over the years, which is all about understanding your audience, your prospects, your leads, your customers, all those things on a deeper level. But I actually think one of the most interesting things about you is how you apply that approach to understanding, growing, and nurturing the people on your own team. I'll level with you here for a second. And some people kind of know this as part of my backstory, but I had a pretty rough upbringing as a kid. And I was always told by people, not everyone, but there was definitely my fair share of people that said, the cards are kind of stacked against you and you have a destiny that's already been decided for you and you can't change that. And I think for most people, that might have stopped them from seeing a growth path in front of them or opportunity in front of them. And I don't know if I'm just maybe personally too stubborn to believe that or what it is, but I can go back and put a pin on my timeline of every mentor or leader, very similar to you, who saw past that sort of unfair, some call it destiny, some say disadvantaged situation or hand that I was dealt, and really helped me to level the playing field. So for one, I just want to start this by saying thank you for being that type of person, that type of mentor, that type of leader, and for building your business around that. It's really incredible. But two, can you sort of share with us the framework you use to create a fair and equitable growth track for your ICs and where that thinking sort of came from?
Sure. I think it's really coming from inspiration from my career. And as a CMO, I worked with companies that were usually outside of the Bay Area, even though I was based there. So I helped bring Greenhouse to market, which was in New York. I worked with Culture Amp, which was in Australia. And then I joined Miro, pre-Miro. It was called Real Time Board then. And a lot of the teams that I was building and mentoring and growing had all come from different backgrounds, different walks of life, different experiences. I think at Miro, I had the biggest sort of revelation about the subtle difference between like cultural background and performance and development. So for example, there were a lot of Russian team members in the early days of Miro. It was a Russian-based company that had moved to Europe later. And you would see people in marketing, two people at the same level in the same job, one being American, knowing more how to advocate for themselves, speak up, sort of demand to know what the next steps are and what that looks like, and the other being Russian, not having that confidence, not having that be part of the cultural background. You just waited until you were promoted or moved up or somebody said something to you. And it really struck me that just because there's, especially in the US, a culture of like self-advocacy and speaking up and the squeaky wheel gets the grease and all that stuff, why is that the case? Why don't we have better systems that make these things more transparent, more bottoms up, more on demand, and more equitable, of course? So I think that obviously led me to most of the work and sort of foundation and philosophies that are baked into the processes that we help companies implement at Pando. A lot of them come down to things like being transparent. So if we're talking about individual contributor career path specifically, in the very early days when I founded the company, for example, and I did this in a lot of my other roles as a leader, I created a leveling framework that was for individual contributors and also for managers. It wasn't necessarily tied to titles, so it wasn't about progressing into a conceptual title, but rather that growth and development. Having compensation bands that aligned with those progressive levels of responsibility and hiring people at levels and not negotiating salary, for example. These are all like the foundational steps that you need to have before the feedback part or the career development part even comes into play, just to make sure that people are entering the organization at a fair point and also with pay parity and fairness around that.
There's this odd notion floating around there that everyone's career aspiration is leadership. And I think we both know that's not true. But the most frustrating part of that notion is that people who don't have leadership aspirations presumably have less growth aspirations, which is also extremely untrue. And I want to change that thinking. I know you want to change that thinking. It's one of the reasons that I developed and implemented a Change Champion program at my last organization and brought it here to train you all, and have found myself very heavily invested in mentorship and mentorship program building, because I do recognize that it can be tough to build a great career path for individual contributors. What would you recommend for companies trying to offer real growth for ICs without sort of funneling them into this inevitable leadership role type of track?
Yeah. I was talking about levels before, and that's sort of the foundation to also thinking about career frameworks and competencies. And this is an easy way to sort of coach and develop talent. What you're talking about, there's actually a phenomenon, I would say, that's been already talked about, but kind of resurfacing, called unbossing. And it's interesting because it's coming out of the wake of, post-pandemic preferences changing for employees who already didn't necessarily want to go into management, but are now like, oh, geez, that job looks real rough. But not only that, but organizations are looking at their structures and thinking like, wow, we have a lot of managers. And unbossing is, there's like two sides of the spectrum. One is having less layers of management and more flat organizations, which means obviously more individual contributors and less middle management. And it also means managers that are a bit more hands-off or focused more on mentorship development, a lot of what you just mentioned that you've built in your program. But the interesting thing about this whole phenomenon and the fact that it's coming to a head now is that it's really a needed correction, I think, of decades of flawed organizational design and structure. So not everybody wants to be a manager, but the way that we've designed these systems, and that's why I talk about leveling so much, is because the way that people move up in your organization, the way that they're paid, how far their career track goes is based on how many levels there are. And the way that these have traditionally worked is that you would have, there's a famous one called Radford, and there's a few others that everybody sort of uses and doesn't really question, and it is what it is, and that's what everybody has, which then ends up in companies like Apple only having 6 levels of engineers, but they have, 100,000 employees. And if you're an engineer there, you're probably a level 4 for 7, 8, 9 years. Like that is zero progression. And so the way that we've structured organizations, we've basically put our money where our mouth is by saying, you can only get to this level as an IC, and then you can go into management. But look at all these management layers, and then there's also executives. So it's like a lot of companies who wanted to create flat structures were actually creating a lot more hierarchy than they needed to. And there's a misconception that creating more individual contributor levels creates more hierarchy when it doesn't, because it's just a clear path upward in your progression, in your expertise. It's not creating hierarchy because you don't report to anybody. So the fact that we've paid managers more, had more manager levels, had IC levels tap out at like junior or very mid-level manager track, basically was us as organizations saying, okay, well, the only way you can move up is to become a manager. And so then everybody wants to be a manager. And then we create this like culture, this cyclical culture of like politics, nepotism, favoritism, all the stuff that actually drives all of this bad behavior that we're now trying to pick apart and unlearn and drive behavior change around feedback culture and transparency and psychological safety because of this like deeply rooted sort of systemic flaw. The good news is, and I think that's probably the easiest thing that companies can do, is to change the organizational structure starting with levels. But that also means that you shouldn't be relying on benchmark data. For example, everybody is like, okay, we need compensation data. We need to hire people. And so they go to Pave or Figures or all of these different tools. And that data is based on how people are currently paid and how they've been paid, which perpetuates this manager pay premium. And it also is just a lagging indicator. So this is not how people should be paid. It's just how they've been paid. Adding more IC levels is something that can easily be done. And again, not associating every level step with a title change is a very easy way to create career progression, create upward mobility, create more equity in where people are at, because those level 4 engineers at Apple, you can bet that the one who's been there for 7 years versus the level 3 that just got leveled up, and then this level 4 is like, we are not at the same level, and they get paid very differently. How do you explain that? So all of these things really can help create more clarity, create more equity, really open up the line for individual contributors in every function, really, to extend their progression. I talk to companies all the time who just say like, oh, well, we don't have this senior of a person in that. And, it depends on the business need, which if somebody is outperforming in their role, and that's an engineer or that's a designer or that's a marketer, and they are just killing it and they're doing all the things that they should be doing at the next level, it is a business need to keep them and to level them up. So I think yeah, just as a quick recap, definitely building a more equitable leveling framework that's balanced between managers and ICs. I don't think getting rid of managers altogether is the solution. It's more about changing the paradigm of how we think about what managers are in that mentorship, in that coaching role, adding more IC levels and creating a lot more transparency around that through career frameworks and things like that.
At my last company, we had about, I think, like 28 directors and managers for like a 200-person company. It was wild. Like we had just way too many top-heavy people and then not enough ICs. And something I saw, and this could be an anomaly, you tell me, because you've worked with a lot more companies, but once people kind of got to that, oh, I'm a director now after, 3 years or something like that, their performance would, in my opinion, it would fall, it would plummet. It was like they had nothing else that they wanted to work up to. It's like, oh, I got my big office and I'm a director now. And like all of their IC contributions were kind of beneath them, but we didn't have enough ICs that they were trying to push that work off onto. And so we still needed them to perform at that IC level while also, being in that director position. And I thought to myself, like, we have just way too many management positions. And then people are working towards getting that. And then for what? Like, they're not motivated to continue to perform at that level. And so I'm curious if you found that creating more levels also helps to continue to keep people motivated and productive and contributing.
Completely. And I think you also create more levels on the manager side too. It's not about having more managers. It's just about having more steps. I think the reason that your organization got to that point and many other organizations get to that point as well is, again, because you tap out at a certain level and you want to keep growing your income, advancing in your career, but you really can't unless you take on a manager role. And then you also end up with all of these like managers managing one person just to give them the, management path or track or opportunity. And there's this other thing that is sort of related to what you were saying called the Peter Principle, which is essentially that we promote people, top performers, we promote them to their level of incompetence. So what usually happens is that's going into management. You have your best engineer, you have your best salesperson, you have your best whatever, and you promote them. And then at some point it's like, okay, well, the next step is a manager. So now you're a manager and you suck at it because actually all of your skills are uniquely positioned to make you really good at that one thing you were doing. But we put you in management and then, the whole team suffers. And there's been a lot of studies and research around that impact. And so the companies who are really thinking about it the right way are holding managers accountable to management practices, to having manager skills like coaching and development and retention. The people function has gotten more strategic over the years. And interestingly, as it's become more strategic, it's also become more decentralized in that as a functional leader, as a CMO, as a head of sales, as a head of engineering, it's actually your responsibility to be able to attract talent and hire talent and develop talent and retain talent. And so we really need to develop managers as managers and not have so many of them probably first. And also not really like having managers be responsible for an individual contributor job plus a manager job is why we can say, oh, well, that's why managers are paid more. But it's really not an efficient way to operate. And there's no reason that you couldn't have a manager that has even more senior people than them on their team. Like if your job as a manager is to facilitate impact at the company, coach and develop people, keep them motivated, keep them engaged. If somebody is one level above you, but you see that kind of thing too. Like, oh, like you can't go higher than this person because you report to them. And it's just kind of why? Like, why?
Yeah, there's norms that we have to break, right? Like these modes of doing things that we've been doing for a long, long time, and you're talking about breaking some of those old traditions down a little bit and looking at things in a different way. I'm really loving this part of the conversation.
We really blown it up completely.
Yeah, right.
Yeah,
I love that. Yeah, let's do it.
I think the pandemic was a nice catalyst for some of this stuff because for the first time and like only time so far has it been that like everybody in the world had to like grapple with the exact same thing at the same time, and work related, what the workplace is and what that means changed so quickly for everybody. There were already kind of trends and evolution, but then all of a sudden it was like everybody is remote, everybody's back in the office, we're hybrid, we're distributed, whatever it is, like we're still kind of figuring it out. But it has kind of loosened a lot of these core structural foundational pieces that made work and the workplace what they are today. But I think we're seeing that that's getting reinvented by the minute.
Which is good. I'm glad to see that. That's us now picking up the pieces of that and like really working and putting it back together the right way. I'm loving this because I'm one of these ICs that we're talking about here. I have always been kind of like, I love being in the weeds of like doing the thing. I had an opportunity at one point in a previous employment to manage a team, and ultimately I passed on it because I didn't feel like that was my thing. What I did is I started looking for roles and other places where I could put my skills to work without the, that manager hat on. And that's been one of the best career decisions I've ever made. And it's kind of led me through what the way I do my work even today and the things that I do today. I think it's really, really important to make sure that these kind of options that we're talking about here are visible to ICs who are not specifically eyeing, that the whole leadership ladder. So I'd love to hear what kinds of career paths or roles have you seen that let ICs build responsibility and get recognized without having to, become the boss?
I mean, I think the one function, I've spent my career in Silicon Valley, so I think there's, I guess, two functions that this was very apparent and where the change happened first, which was in engineering. So a really, really strong engineer is not someone that you want to force into a manager role, and it is someone that you want to retain. And we've all heard the stories of, Meta or Google or whatever, OpenAI engineers getting paid, millions of dollars, and these are individual contributors. So that, I think, has been a lot of people-centric organizations that I've worked with in Silicon Valley and outside of Silicon Valley, take a lot of the lead from engineering, mostly because you have to get engineering's buy-in on any people program that you do, but also because they are very focused on retaining talent. So engineering is one. I mean, sales also is one where, your top performing salesperson can make in terms of how much commission, how much money they bring in, all of the leaders at the company. Like that's definitely possible. Not necessarily right, but that's a topic for another podcast. But I think there's data scientists, there's doctors, there's professors. I mean, there's so many types of roles. It's more to me about kind of shifting the mindset and shifting the paradigm. And this is something that we work with a lot of organizations to do. And most of them are willing to embrace it and ready to embrace it, even to the extent of pay parity between the two career tracks. I think that's where it really counts. Because if you just have levels side by side and say, yeah, you can get as high as a senior director, but then the comp is, $100K less or whatever, then it's not really the same. But I do see organizations moving in that direction. I have talked to many CEOs also who are like, yeah, why do we want all these managers? Why wouldn't we want people just to keep progressing? But it's like, all you have to do is ask, why are we doing this really? Because so many of the other things around, not having a business case to promote somebody or all of those things are related to, well, now they're a manager and do we have people who are going to report to them or whatever it is. So I think any role in corporate especially can be extended: sales, legal, customer success. I do think still that to get to executive level, you most likely are going to be a manager if you're at that level. And what I've seen most common is like ICs going up to senior director, but then when it's like VP executive, usually it's a manager role. However, it's not always the case. I worked at a company before that had, a chief security officer that did not have any direct reports. So I think there's so many different ways. And the good news is that a lot of companies are changing their ways and changing their thinking. And a lot of, people leaders who are coming up in their career today are also, millennial or part of Gen Z, driving those behaviors and kind of shifts from the bottom up.
Yeah, there's a lot of things you're describing there that I've seen that we've done here at Trainual very, very well. And you see a lot of people on the team who they started in one role, but they've gone to others that are not exactly the same, not even in the same vein. Yeah. And I think the reason why is that we've had great leadership that has identified the skill sets and the potential in these other areas and have made those options available to those people. And so we have people who have been in several departments, like I said, but because that's where their skills have driven them, not just simply what their career track looked like. Right.
Yeah, of course. I think I've seen a lot of transition from, sales to customer success. I've seen a sales rep go into engineering. Like there's a lot of different kind of ways that you can overlap your competencies and your skills. And I think that, people are always open to new opportunities and trying new things if they want to explore. And so there's like, nope, I'm an engineer, I'm staying an engineer. There's, an engineer that's like, maybe I'll like product management better and does that. And I think, creating those opportunities, obviously being able to hire from within, I think having a good recruiting process that also is recruiting internally in a fair way. This is something we did when I was at Greenhouse. Like we had the interview kit still, you still went through an interview process, but certainly had opportunities to go cross-functionally or into new orgs.
Yeah. It's awesome.
Well, I want to switch gears here because there's two parts to this conversation. And the first part is really just figuring out like, what do those career tracks look like? Where are people headed? And then the other part is giving them feedback along the way in a way that is fair, it's unbiased, it's caring, but it's also direct and it's clear. And I think you have just so many great insights for this topic. And we hear a lot about giving feedback, and there's probably endless takes on doing it right. But one thing I think that's not as touched on is the underlying biases that can come out in feedback. I personally had a prior exec make comments about my nose ring and my tattoos. I've got like a weird, half sleeve that I got when I was 16, and I'm having it removed, so it doesn't look great. And she made comments about the fact that it didn't look professional and it affected my ability to be professional, to sit in meetings and to do things. And I thought, that's crazy. Like, I'm going to do the same level of work no matter what. And we know that that's not even a drop in the bucket on this topic, or the biases that people face in the workplace that don't look like me and that don't look like Sean. And so what's your take on building a solid feedback system that actually helps people grow and isn't influenced by those underlying biases?
So I think, well, first you need an organization who's willing to like do the work to do it right. And, it takes effort to make sure that you're thinking about your unconscious bias and implementing tools and tactics to reduce that when you're giving feedback, when you're giving performance feedback, when you're doing assessments, whatever it is. the way that I think about it and how we do it with my team and how I've always done it with my team. So I guess that's why there's a product now. Is like, we know from an unconscious bias perspective that if people have the clarity of what the expectation is up front, if they have that in front of them when they're making an assessment or giving feedback, those types of things significantly reduce the amount of unconscious bias that can crop up. And so, for example, I've talked a lot about levels. So when we think about feedback, one of the things that is a great tool for feedback is a career framework. And what a career framework is essentially competencies based on your role that are mapped to your level and everybody's level. Many organizations will have some portion of this as their values, for example, or maybe operating principles that everybody at the company has that they're held accountable for. And then there's some portion of that will be specific to you as an engineer or you as a marketer or you as a salesperson. But the important thing is that framework then has specific definition for, okay, we're talking about communication. So what does communication look like holistically? What's our, big picture definition for that? And then what does it look like if you're a level 1? What does it look like if you're a level 2? What does it look like if you're a level 3? What are some example behaviors? So that if I'm a manager, I'm not thinking of Joe over here, who's like a great communicator, great storyteller, and using him as my anchor for how I'm going to assess everybody else on communication, but rather I'm going to anchor that in their level specific expectations. So integrating competency-based, also level-based expectations for individuals that are provided upfront to them when they join the company, before they join the company, in the interview process, during onboarding, in weekly ceremonies and cadences, how they give feedback peer-to-peer is really important. And then using tools, even if you're thinking about, okay, I'm going to give feedback on communication, and here's what it means for a level 2 versus a level 4 or whatever it is. But then also using other tools, there's many different frameworks for feedback. The high level kind of concepts like radical candor, which is more about like caring personally and challenging directly. There's also things like SBI, which is a really easy tactical way to give feedback, which is situation, behavior, impact. So you're not giving someone personal feedback about them, but rather, here's the situation. This is the behavior I observed. This is the impact of that behavior, which is not you and everything you are. It's just one behavior that happened on that day or whatever. And so having these tools readily available, especially for managers in their sort of day-to-day conversations and how they're thinking about their one-on-ones, having more, in a very agile way, continuous iterative feedback loops will help to erase a lot of the bias and subjectivity that comes with, oh, we're doing an annual review. This is the only time the person's getting feedback. And I'm just thinking about, there's recency bias, there's halo bias, there's so many biases that when you don't have a framework, when you don't have a structure, when you don't have transparency, will 100% creep in. And unfortunately, we use that data most often to decide who's getting promoted at the company. And that's where you end up with, leadership pipelines that aren't very diverse. Same with hiring. If you don't have those criteria and that structure in place when you're interviewing someone, when you're assessing their abilities in the interview process, it's the same kind of thing.
I love those resources that you shouted out to. Radical Candor with Kim Scott's a great book if you haven't read it. And we also use a really similar feedback method. It's almost identical. It's just labeled a little differently, and it's called BIC, Behavior Impact Question. So identifying the behavior, how was the impact, or what was the impact, and then asking a question for how we can kind of move forward from there. So I really loved those actionable takeaways that you shared. And I want to flip the table here and come back to something you said as well, which is feedback when it's done right is great. And feedback's a powerful tool for keeping people around and that retention that you talked about as well. And for me personally, feedback is absolutely rocket fuel. I get consistent monthly feedback from my boss that says, here's where you're crushing it and all the great things you're doing. And then here's where I want you to dig in and keep improving and keep working. And I've personally asked for it to be laid out this way. Like, I want to know what I'm doing well so I can keep doing it well. And I also want to know where I can improve so that I can continue to contribute as an IC or grow in my career ladder, whatever the case may be. But also to, and now as a people manager, to keep making the right kind of impact for my team as well as the business. Because both types of feedback drive my performance pretty equally.
Yeah.
And, speak to that impact that I'm making and where I feel like I can make a bigger impact or my team can make a bigger impact. All that to say, how do you think companies should use feedback to develop their people and also make them feel appreciated so that they stick around and we kind of, retain them and can help them on their career paths?
I mean, I definitely think it goes back to kind of interweaving it into the day-to-day processes, like the framework that you just shared about how you like to get feedback and how you do it monthly. I've done quarterly look back outlook where you look back at the quarter, you look forward, and there's always kind of a structure and a cadence around it. I think pulling again from engineering, a lot of companies use, things like start, stop, continue, which is a really lightweight, easy way to even do on a weekly or bi-weekly basis, and also with a team. So I think a lot of people feel like it's not their job to give peer feedback, or they don't know how to give peer feedback. This is, again, where competencies come into play, because if you're giving feedback to somebody where you have an option to select a competency based on their job. Say you're an engineer and they're a designer, and you can give a feedback on UX, and here's what UX means for this person. Then it's much easier for me to give some constructive feedback or, a little tip or something I would suggest to do differently or whatever, rather than like a blank slate that's like, how do you think this person did? It's like, good. I don't know. So I think, having these ceremonial moments that you can create, it's easy for engineering to do in, retrospectives, but we've done retrospectives in marketing, and we used to do them as executive leadership teams as well. And that's a way to kind of have collective feedback. And I think creating more comfort around getting feedback just means that you need to do it a lot more often, and realize that it doesn't always have to be like a big thing either, that it can just be short, small, iterative moments and feedback of when it's happening. And that can sometimes be on Slack, that can sometimes be in one-on-one meetings, whatever it is. I think we really need to make sure that managers are trained to be managers and to give feedback. That's really, in my opinion, one of the main jobs of a manager. So peer feedback has its place, but like managers are the ones who really should be doing it. I think feedback around specific things and managers being able to tie those things. Okay, you're doing great across these dimensions, and here's some areas you can double down. And why can I double down there? How is that going to impact? How is that going to move the needle for the business goals, helping individual contributors really connect the dots between what they're doing, what they're focused on, and what the business is trying to do, and why that's a better priority or thing to focus on. I think positive feedback is a really great ritual that everybody can do on like weekly team meetings, one-on-ones, anything like that. And also, of course, public praise, everybody loves. And I've been on both sides of public praise, where it's like, I've been in organizations where they want to call out every single person in that group or the whole group instead of single any one person out. And sometimes it's good to also single those people out, because if you're just always part of a group, then you don't necessarily feel that you're being recognized individually either. think it really depends on the company culture, but I've seen sort of both ends of that spectrum as well.
It's so cool to hear you talk about some of these tools, because I think at Trainual we use so many of them, and it makes me really proud to work for this team and to be a part of this team. We use Start, Stop, Continue. It's one of the first things I learned a couple years ago when I started at Trainual, and it has become my favorite continuous improvement tool. I think it's just something that everybody can do, and it's so simple and so impactful. So I definitely wanted to highlight that one, because I think, like I said, it's a really, really great tool that everybody can use. It's a great place to start.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we've talked about a lot of different aspects of feedback here. And as we get close to the end here, I want to ask a question about really just what's the best way to ensure consistency in the feedback process? We've talked about BIC, we've talked about, several of these different frameworks. How do we be consistent, and how do you coach your team members to use those feedback strategies?
I mean, embedding it in workflows as much as possible is probably the easiest way. So however you can do that, obviously there's tools that you can do that. You can create templates in places, whatever it is. Like there's definitely training around it that you will have to do. But I also think that, again, I go back to training managers, specifically spending time doing that on what these protocols or templates or approaches that you want to take as an organization look like. And having peer-to-peer spaces for managers to learn how to do that also. So if you're doing a training on feedback, then have them do role-playing with feedback, or have peers give each other feedback on feedback they're giving to their reports. Make it more kind of cooperative, I guess. And I think if managers are measured and evaluated and compensated and rewarded on whether or not they do this well, I can tell you that they'll figure out how to do better.
Makes sense. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I always love really focusing on how are we coaching and bringing people up so that this is part of the culture of the organization, right? And that's something that I've found enormously helpful in my role here is that we do that. And there's a lot of those feedback loops and being able to come back and have it be a safe experience for everyone. So I appreciate the emphasis on going back and making sure that is part of the culture.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's also not putting so much pressure on feedback. Most people's experience with feedback is giving feedback for a 360 review that some manager is going to read and collate, and the employee never gets to see. And then the manager delivers them something that's here's what we think about you. So it's really, even for individuals, when it comes to feedback, that's what their experience has been, both on the receiving end of the review, but also on giving review feedback to peers that won't see it. And it's anonymous. But at the same time, your pay is going to be tied to that. So I don't want to be too mean, but whatever it is. So it's really, again, these systems and processes that we've been that have resulted in cultural behaviors and norms that we actually don't want. So we have to unlearn. But yeah, making it easy and lightweight, I think that's number one. And we know, when it comes to psychological safety, the teams that are performing the best are the ones who are comfortable talking about failure and realizing that it's how you learn and how you move forward, and not, making everything a huge deal and just, okay, what are we learning from that? Okay, great. Obviously, if it keeps happening, then that might be a different issue, and that's something that would need to be addressed.
So true. And I love that you said the best way to implement this and create consistency around it is templates and training, because that's definitely what we're all about here. And so we will have a template with all of the incredible things that Barbara called out in terms of BIC and giving feedback and some of these other, start, stop, continue frameworks. We're going to build it all into an incredible template with her that we will have in our show notes. So be sure to check that out. And thank you so much for joining us today, Barbara. Tell folks where they can follow you, connect with you, continue to follow you on your journey.
I think LinkedIn is probably the easiest. And I think I'm just /Barbara Gago because I've been on LinkedIn that long. But I'm also there every day. So come and find me.
I love it. Well, any last words of wisdom for folks today?
I mean, I think just like your theme of this whole podcast, and I love the title, Trust the Process. I think it's just like there does require some process and you need to create transparency, but it's also a process that continues to evolve and grow, and just take baby steps and implement a few of the things that we've talked about, and you'll be well on your way. And fix your levels, because I'm sure you need to do that.
Awesome. What a good word. Well, as always, document your processes and be a good human. We will catch you next time.